got so many complaints about the last episode. They're going to kick poor Humpty off the internet if he doesn't start catching some fish. So what we're going to do is I'll send Humpty out fishing, and if there's nothing interesting happening, I'll just minimize the screen and slide him down into the corner like this, and then get on with my rant about fish habitat on the main screen. And if anything interesting happens out on the lake, if Humpty gets a bite, I'll toggle back and put him on the main screen. Pretty cool, eh? I mentioned in previous episodes that even as a kid growing up in Chicago, I had read about steelhead fishing on Vancouver Island in stories written by people like Roderick Haig Brown. And I remember him talking about his favorite fish of all, the rare and elusive summer steelhead. When I finally moved to BC, I learned that nobody fishes for steelhead in summer. After the start of May, the season is pretty much over. Except I remember meeting this one old-timer. I can't even remember who he was anymore, but he told me that you can catch steelhead every month of the year in the fabulous N2 watershed. Of course, he didn't call it that. That's my name. Now, even back then, I never met anybody else who ever claimed to catch steelhead in summer, even if they were lying, so I paid no attention to what this old guy told me, but it always stuck in my memory. So over time, I started fishing for steelhead, and I actually caught my first steelhead ever in the N2 River. In those days, the whole river was all virgin timber. You had to take a boat up to the mouth and then hike and wade upstream from the mouth. There were no roads, and you just had to wade up from tidewater. So decades went by, and I kept on fishing in late winter like everybody else, but I never forgot what that old guy told me. And when I moved back to BC to retire, I began to go back at other times of the year. I was trying to gather some data in regard to the null hypothesis that you can't catch steelhead in summer. And in previous episodes of the Bastravaganza, I've documented Humpty ticking off the months one by one until by the end of episode 9, I was down to only 1 month of the year when I had not caught a steelhead in fabulous N2 Lake. And that month was June. And by the way, that was the only month of the year when I'd never tried fishing for steelhead. So you can see where this is going, and you know exactly where I was going to be next June. So here I am out on fabulous N2 Lake. I had just set up on my spot when a rain squall passed over. So I had to dash under the overhanging branches of a cedar tree and wait out the shower. Now the shower has passed, and I've turned the camera on for the final test of the null hypothesis. The first time I ever tried to catch a steelhead in June. I started the timer exactly when I turned the camera on. Now let's see how long it takes Humpty to get a bite from a June steelhead. I'm throwing out a giant MEP spinner. This was back in the days when I still used store-bought spinners. Well, this is getting pretty boring. I'm going to minimize this and get on with my tale of two rivers. We'll slide Humpty down there in the corner, and if anything interesting happens, we can zoom back in on him like this. In the previous episode, I went into some detail to show changes that have occurred in the N2 River after clear-cut logging. Now let's look at some of the impacts from these changes. First off, let's shift our attention from fish for a moment and think about trees. Most of the canopy here was ancient Sitka spruce and red cedar, mostly over 1 meter thick and sometimes over 3 meters at the base. These gigantic old-growth logs are worth a small fortune as lumber. And the important function the big riparian trees provided in terms of bank stability is turned into a fisheries disaster when they plug the channel with masses of driftwood. Both as lumber or as riparian habitat, it would seem that the value of this forest is enormous. I'm not going to dwell on the cash value of this wood except to state the obvious. Salvaging only a few of these giant trees could generate enough cash to fund a large amount of restoration work. Why let it all tumble into a smashed heap of driftwood? Now let's discuss some of the impacts on fish habitat. Before we take a close look at N2 River, let's take a quick paddle around the N5 River and remind ourselves what it's like in this unlogged stream. Even though this video was shot during one of the most crippling droughts in recent BC history, when all fishing in all rivers across southern BC was shut down due to low stream flows, notice that there's still enough water here to float a canoe between the pools. And notice that there are big, deep pools filled with clean water. And notice that on this day there are big fish holding in the deepest pools. Notice that the pools are stable. The old-growth trees growing along the shore are proof that this channel has not shifted in centuries. The tree cover keeps the stream cool. Notice that the huge trees hold the riverbank in place. The roots of these big, immovable trees force the flood currents to dig deeper instead of spreading out wider. It's these big trees that create the deep pools. The riffles between the pools are stable and submerged under steady flows. There are no huge log jams that plug the river and slow the current and force the river to deposit sediment that buries the main channel. Instead, large isolated drift logs with their root wads locked into the roots of big live trees provide obstacles where the current scours deep holes and channels. As the river approaches the lake, it flows over a bed of superb, stable spawning gravel, where salmon and trout hatch thousands of eggs every year. Now let's compare these scenes with video I shot during similar drought conditions at N2 River. This is the same type of location, a similar sized river flowing into a mountain lake. Do you notice a difference? There's no visible water. The channel is wide, very wide. In places it's 5 to 10 times wider than the channel at N5 Lake, but it's dry. Instead of deep pools, there are acres of dry gravel littered with fresh driftwood. When the flow drops in N5 River, the young fish move back into deeper water in the middle of the channel. When the flow drops in the N2 River, the little salmon and trout are stranded in isolated pools, separated by huge dunes of gravel. The entire area is buried in flood gravel, so when it stops raining, the flow percolates through the gravel instead of flowing over it. Nowadays, there's often no surface flow at all upstream from the lake, just isolated, stagnant pools separated by enormous mounds of gravel. Many salmon and trout fry are trapped in these pools every year. They can't get back to flowing water because the river is now flowing underground here. When the surface flow stops, the pools become stagnant and clogged with algae, and the water quality gets stinky. Let's check back in at the lake. You can see that it's been over 5 minutes and Humpty hasn't had a single bite. It's almost as boring as listening to a talk about river hydrology. I think I've mentioned before that Humpty has a very short attention span. If he doesn't get a bite soon, he might just pack it in and go find something more fun to do. He might decide to hike in and look at some giant trees, or go up and film the smash zone where the river enters the lake, or go film the mugulls that nest on this lake, or just sit out on this beautiful lake and watch the mountains. What if the star gets so bored that he walks out on his own show? Oops, pay attention.
All right.
I think I had a bite.
Could be my first June steelhead.
6 minutes and 2 seconds. It's a slow day at fabulous N2 Lake. Well, there's no doubt about it. Humpty is in business, and it looks like he just might put that null hypothesis to the test.
Oh, yeah.
Eventually, I get the fish close enough to the boat that I can see the flash of my big spinner deep down in the lake.
I can see my spinner.
And as I suspected, it's clamped in the jaws of a big silver fish.
Oh, yeah.
The superstar bass fishermen with their 300-horse motors and metal flake purple boats, they just yank those big bass right out of the lily pads.
That is my first June steelhead.
But poor Humpty is old and feeble, and he's barely able to hang on to his fish. I'll start the timer again, beginning when the fish chopped the spinner. This fish took one look at Humpty and made a quick executive decision to head the other way. My ancient Mitchell reel is old and feeble too, and the drag is worn out so it doesn't make any noise. I'll add some high-tech sound effects here so you can hear what it would have been like if I'd been fishing with a new reel. You can see Humpty foolishly reaching for the net. Meanwhile, the fish is thinking about heading back to the Bering Sea. Well, it looks like Humpty's got his hands full there, and he's going to be busy for a while. Any rock star TV bass fisherman would have had half a dozen fish in the boat by now, and he'd be selling you something special that you absolutely need to catch fish like he does. But Humpty has an old beater reel and a rod that's already broken in half from old age. We'll put him back down in the corner and let him tug on that fish for a while and get back to talking about rivers and the habitat that this big fish came so far to find. I was talking about how the N2 River dries up in summer and a lot of young fish get stranded in isolated pools. There may be 100 baby salmon and steelhead swimming in this pool, but they'll all soon be dead. If the stinky water doesn't kill them, they'll surely die when the water table drops below the bottom of the pool. The thousands of tons of fresh gravel that now plug the main channel here are almost useless to spawning fish because it goes dry or shifts around in floods before any eggs can hatch. If fish lay their eggs in this wasteland of shifting gravel, those eggs are sure to die when the gravel goes dry or gets buried or flushed down into the lake during the next storm. Well, this fish is determined to head back to the shallow water where I hooked it, and the wind is pushing me that way too. But I have an electric motor and the fish does not.
Boy, by the time I get him close to the boat, the wind is blowing me back into the shallow. Don't want that. Oh, that's a nice fish. Oh, that is a nice fish. Missed, man.
Notice that except where there's slime algae growing in stagnant water, the gravel is shiny clean. It's almost dead. Nothing grows in it because even if it stays wet, it shifts around with every rain. Well, this fish is pulling my whole boat in towards shallow water, so I have to turn on the zirconium ionic booster on my electric motor to try to keep it from getting in where it can tangle me up in a weed bed or snag me off on a log. I'm letting out line while I drive out to deeper water, but always keeping the line tight so the fish can't spit the hook out. I'm using 10-pound test nylon monofilament line, so the further away the fish gets, the more stretch there is in the line and the harder it is for the fish to shake loose. There's little chance for aquatic invertebrates, which may require years of relatively stable gravel habitat to reach maturity. There are almost no insects growing in the shifting beds of gravel here, even when they are underwater. There's little food for fish here. In the logged-off river, the wetted channel is just a trickle surrounded by acres of dead, dry gravel. Hello there! And thanks for making this guest appearance on the Bass Extravaganza. Is that big fish going to fit in my tiny little net? There are no branches hanging over the stream for a bug to fall off. Even when there's enough flow for fish to swim in, there's almost nothing here for them to eat. In this extremely wide, shallow section of river, there's nowhere for a fish to hide. No deep water, no scour holes under root wads, just acres of flat, shallow gravel. Any fish that ventures into this zone is extremely vulnerable to predators like eagles and bears and otters.
Just a tug of war now. He's got the wind in his favor, but I got the motor. I don't want to drift into the shallows here. I'm in full bore reverse and just slugging it out.
There's probably just as much water flowing into N2 Lake on this day as there is flowing into N5 Lake, but here it's flowing beneath acres of flood gravel and smashed wood, not on the surface where fish can swim in it.
Come on. Oh, what a fish.
This habitat destruction does a lot more than cripple spawning habitat.
It's going to take my whole battery just to land this one fish. Back in the shallows again.
Big adult salmon and steelhead, especially this river's population of rare summer steelhead, used to migrate between the lake and deep sanctuary pools in the upper river during summer. Now they can't do this. Juvenile fish used to migrate back and forth by the thousands between the lake and the river all summer, seeking out the best food sources and escaping predators.
That is a strong fish. That is one strong fish.
There once was one or at the most two channels providing world-class salmonid habitat, channels that rarely took the life of the big riparian trees during floods.
Let's go out deeper. Let's go out deeper. You want to go out deeper? Yeah, you want to go deeper too, I see. I think my steelhead got eaten by a halibut. Or an orca.
There are now many channels, none of which provide quality fish habitat, and all of them undercutting big trees. In a few short years, we've not only obliterated some of the finest spawning area on Earth, we've converted it into a place salmon can barely get past. Here you can see a new channel, 2 meters deep, slashed through the big old forest in November 2016.
This could go on for a while. It's just hugging the bottom now.
As soon as these new channels begin to form, they undercut the big trees around them, which fall into the new channel and cause more problems. It's a perpetual motion machine of disaster for fish and trees and a lot more. It's not only the trees that tip over. The root wads of the huge old trees rip out enormous amounts of soil when the trees tip over. Look at the amount of soil and clay around the roots of this small hemlock, maybe 1/2 meter in diameter. Imagine the amount of dirt in the roots of a tree 5 times this size. All this dirt and clay, which is what grew the giant forest in the first place, is now washed downstream, where it will smother fish eggs and smother the lake bottom. The standing forest acts like a giant sieve, straining out all the big driftwood and most of the boulders, and clogging up the natural flow. Whatever gets flushed through this sieve is dumped into the lake, where it's creating a huge new mud and gravel bar. Now let's migrate downstream like a baby salmon and look at the lake. The most productive part of a river lake system is usually the estuary, where the river flows into the lake, spreading cool, clean water and nutrients over a gravel bar that expands a little bit every year as more and more sediment flows down the river. Look at the inlet river above N5 Lake. The gravel bar is stable with no sign of recent disturbance. Immediately up from the lake is a reach of superb spawning gravel.
He just peeled off about 200 feet of line.
was there, the shallow water around the bar was swarming with small fish, tiny trout, salmon, and sticklebacks, and there was a healthy mix of algae and rooted aquatic weeds growing on the bottom.
Maybe I got a chance. This is my chance while the wind dies down. Oh, I think that tired him out. Coming right into the boat now. Let's have another look at you, big boy.
Now look at the outlet of Upper N2 River. The old western main outlet from the pre-logging era has been almost abandoned as the river blasted down the eastern outlet and flushed thousands of truckloads of fresh gravel into the lake. The old shoreline there is buried under a layer of gravel and mud 20 meters thick. Instead of fertilizing the most productive part of the lake, like the sediments do at the stable unlogged river outlook, here they smother it every year. After every big rain, the most productive part of the lake is buried under another layer of fresh gravel and silt. In recent years, as the main channel gets plugged more and more,
Like weightlifting.
the river is aggressively cutting side channels through the standing timber and scouring huge amounts of clay from around the roots of the big trees and flushing it into the lake. This is filling in the upper right-hand corner of the lake. What happens gradually over hundreds or thousands of years in an unlogged watershed happens really fast here. The larger sediments are flushed down the new main channel and sink to the bottom as soon as they enter the lake, where they're building up a big gravel bar. The clay and mud don't settle immediately. After a big storm, the lake may remain cloudy for weeks or months.
Oh, there it is. I think yeah, I see it again. Back within sight. Oh, that's a big fish. Look at that.
On a summer day when the lake is glassy calm, you'll notice that certain areas of the lake are seething with tiny bubbles, like a kettle just about to boil. One bubble zone spreads out directly from the new river outlet. The other appears to be a plume that spreads out from the outlet of the only main tributary creek to this lake, which was also clear-cut during recent years. My suspicion is that the bubbles are methane, formed by bacteria digesting organic sediments that have been buried in fresh mud. What are the ecological impacts when you have large sections of the lake that are constantly bubbling with methane gas? What effect does this methane bubbling have on oxygen levels in the water column? Well, it looks like Humpty is beginning to get the upper hand.
Oh, you're not going to fit in my net.
Let's go back and check him out. We're getting ready for the showdown at the OK Corral, so you can see me setting and resetting my old worn-out drag. The closer the fish gets to the boat, the easier it is for it to snap the line. But if I don't keep the drag tight, I'll never get this fish near my rinky-dink little net. I'm keeping tension on the fish while I hold the boat offshore with the motor and get my drag set just right for the last pass into the net. I know I can lead its head into the net, but will the rest of it fit in too? By now my right forearm is burning. It feels like somebody's pouring battery acid onto the muscles. I've never had a fish on a line this long, but I'm not about to give up, and neither is the fish. I turn the boat and make one last run offshore to make sure I'm clear of snags before I lead the fish into the net. Now I'm where I want to be, so I kill the motor and make one last test of my drag setting. We're approaching the crust of the biscuit, as Frank Zappa used to say. Either this fish is going into the net or my right arm is going to fall off at the elbow, or maybe both. What the heck am I going to do if I actually do get the fish into the net? This may be the biggest steelhead I've ever had on a line, and I sure don't want it coming aboard my boat. You can see the spot where I hooked the fish way off against the far shore. and we've been slugging it out every inch of the way. And now it's time to convince this fish to settle down and pose for the vast extravaganza. Now I can begin to understand why Roderick Haig Brown was so obsessed with summer steelhead. Once again, I can't fathom why we choose to brutalize their sacred homeland. Finally, you can see the tip of the big fish's tail break the surface. And when it finally rolls on its side, it's time to lead it to the net. What a scrap. It's do or die now. So I never disproved the null hypothesis, but I came pretty darn close. And that day kind of completed a circle for me. Wild steelhead from the same watershed during every month of the calendar.
The net was too small. I told you.
And the first thing I did when I got back home was that I went out and bought a bigger net. And believe it or not, I actually joined the Fly Fishers Club here in Nanaimo. And they had a speaker at one of their meetings. He was a way better fisherman than me, which isn't saying much, but he'd been fishing all his life and all over North America, I think, and he'd written books, and he said he had never caught a steelhead in June. And he'd gone up to northern BC to fish the Kispiox River, maybe the most famous steelhead river in the BC and the world maybe, which is apparently also about to be closed to recreational fishing because its wild fish are going extinct. But that's another story. Anyway, he booked accommodations and hired, an expensive guide to fish the best steelhead water in the world, and he didn't get a bite from a June steelhead. So, you see, the problem with this net is actually big enough to get the fish in, but it just wasn't deep enough. I had to get a deeper net. So anyway, some people spend their lives chasing for fish like the one you just saw on film. And, I didn't book a trip to some exotic location. I did it right here on Vancouver Island, and it took me 6 minutes and 2 seconds to connect with that one, and I was still drinking the Slurpee I'd bought from the 7-Eleven. And it's not because I'm a better fisherman, it's because I was in the right place at the right time. Certainly not because I had better gear. That film is a testament to the kind of fish that used to swim in our rivers and lakes back in the days when Roderick Haig Brown was casting flies at them. Wild fish like you saw are just getting rubbed off the face of the earth. And it's logging and gill nets that are driving the extinction here on Vancouver Island, not recreational fishermen. The ecosystem that spawned these fish is being ruined by clear-cut logging. The habitat just upstream from N2 Lake is getting worse every year, not better. And there's no attempt by any company or government to intervene. After 20 years of government cutbacks, there's nobody left to even go out and look at places like this. So let's hope there might be changes coming in the way we manage our watersheds at the federal and provincial and tribal levels. And I want to give a shout out to nonprofits everywhere that are working to improve stream and fish habitat. In particular to one nonprofit in that area, the Central West Coast Forest Society. They've been working hard to do the kind of in-stream restoration work that is so badly needed. And it was their drone that shot those recent aerial views. So if you have a few dollars kicking around that you might want to donate to somebody, or a few thousand or a few million, check them out. And I'm going to produce one more episode in this Tale of Two Rivers series that will suggest how humans might intervene in this valley to limit the ongoing slaughter of giant trees and to restore and improve the stream habitat for salmon and trout. But first we need to take a break from all this carnage and ruin and clear our minds and actually go out and catch some fish. So next time we're going to go out and head out on another midnight bass fishing expedition with topwater lures. And we'll make another tribute to our hero, Fred Arbogast. And not only that, You know, something I've always wanted to do after I ticked off the June steelhead off of my bucket list. Uh, I wanted to be the first fishing show that has an interview with a real live extraterrestrial. So next time I'm hoping to have a special guest appearance.
All hail Fred.
All hail Fred! And stay tuned for the next episode of the Bass Stravaganza.